Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, we journey into the heart of a forgotten empire to tell the story of the Night Riders of Kanem-Bornu, warriors whose horses carried the weight of a kingdom across the burning edges of the Sahara. The wind here moves differently, doesn't just pass, it remembers. In the vast Sahel, where golden sand merges into dry grasslands, each grain has tasted iron and sweat. The dunes have heard the thunder of hooves, the crack of whips, and the rattle of armor. Beneath these same stars, entire civilizations once breathed in rhythm with the horses they rode. The Empire of Kanem-Bornu, a sprawling realm that once stretched across what is now Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Libya, was not just built by powerful kings. It was forged and held together by its riders, lean, sun-scorched men who knew both loyalty and exhaustion, both unwavering faith and biting fear. They were soldiers, swift messengers, and sometimes ghosts vanishing into the shimmering dunes for months, returning only with stories etched on their faces or scars on their skin. Tonight, we ride with them. We'll move slowly, gently, without rush, immersing ourselves in their world of dust, devotion, and discipline. We will feel the sting of sand whipped against our faces by the desert wind, hear the constant creak of leather armor, and taste the precious water that barely quenches an endless thirst. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly, and we rest beneath a canopy of stars, just as they did centuries ago. You're listening to Under Baobab Skies, and the story begins now. The horse was more than an animal to the Kanem-Bornu rider. It was a partner, a weapon, and a status symbol all in one. These weren't just any horses. They were a prized breed, adapted over generations to thrive in this harsh landscape. Strong, resilient, and capable of enduring incredible hardship, they were the engines of the empire. A warrior's bond with his horse was forged in shared struggle, the blistering heat of day, the chilling cold of night, the constant threat of ambush. He would often give his horse water before he drank himself, knowing that his life depended entirely on the strength of his mount. The armor they wore wasn't the gleaming plate mail of European knights. It was practical, crafted from quilted cotton or leather, thick enough to stop an arrow but light enough to allow for speed and agility. This armor, often layered and padded, offered surprising protection while allowing the riders to withstand the extreme temperatures of the sun. Their primary weapon was the lance, long and deadly, used to devastating effect in cavalry charges that could shatter enemy formations. But they were also skilled archers and swordsmen, a versatile fighting force capable of both shock tactics and prolonged skirmishes. Imagine the sight. A column of these riders appearing over a dune, their lances glinting in the sun. A silent, disciplined force moving as one. They were the masters of desert warfare, using the terrain to their advantage. They could appear as if from nowhere, strike with precision, and vanish back into the sands before an enemy could even mount a response. They knew every oasis, every hidden pass, every trick the desert could play. This intimate knowledge of the land was a weapon as potent as any spear. They didn't just cross the desert, they belonged to it. But their role went far beyond the battlefield. The riders were the lifeblood of Kanem-Bornu's economy. They patrolled the trans-Saharan trade routes, the vital arteries that connected West Africa to the Mediterranean world. Caravans laden with gold, salt, ivory, and enslaved people relied on the protection of these mounted warriors to fend off raiders and ensure safe passage. Their presence guaranteed the flow of wealth that funded the empire's courts, armies, and mosques. They were also the emperor's eyes and ears. As messengers, they could cover vast distances at incredible speeds, carrying royal decrees, intelligence reports, and diplomatic messages across the sprawling realm. A message that might take a caravan weeks to deliver could be carried by a relay of riders in a matter of days. This rapid communication network was essential for governing such a vast and often volatile territory, allowing the Mai, the emperor, to project his authority far from the capital. Their lives were governed by a strict code of discipline and a deep sense of duty. Loyalty to the Mai was absolute. This allegiance was often intertwined with their Islamic faith, which had become central to the empire's identity. They saw themselves not just as soldiers of an emperor, but as defenders of the faith, guardians of a divinely sanctioned order. This spiritual conviction gave them a resilience that went beyond mere physical endurance. It was a source of strength during long, lonely patrols and a source of courage in the face of death. When they weren't on campaign or patrol, their lives revolved around training. Horsemanship was practiced from a young age, and endless drills honed their skills with the lance, sword, and bow. This constant preparation ensured that the cavalry of Kanem-Bornu remained one of the most formidable fighting forces in Africa for centuries. The legacy of the Kanem-Bornu riders lives on, not in grand monuments of stone, but in the stories and traditions of the Sahelian people. It echoes in the horsemanship of the Tabu and Canary people today, in the colorful equestrian festivals that still celebrate the bond between man and horse. They represent a remarkable chapter in human history, a testament to how a people, through skill, discipline, and a profound connection to their environment, could build and sustain a powerful empire on the edge of the world's greatest desert. They were more than just warriors. They were the sinews that held a civilization together, riding through the dust and the dark, under the vast and watchful baobab skies. Thank you for joining us on this journey tonight. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the heart of history. We'll see you next time. You are now under baobab skies. Let the story begin. By the end of this journey, you'll understand what it meant to live and to survive as a Kanem-Bornu cavalryman. Imagine dawn rising over Lake Chad. The horizon is bruised purple, the air cool for only a moment before the sun burns it away. The riders rise before the birds. They stretch their aching limbs, roll their prayer mats toward the east, and whisper verses that blend with the soft grunt of horses. Their armor, made of hardened leather and brass plates, catches the first light like scattered fire. Then, the commander gives the nod, and the world begins to move. To be a cavalryman in Kanem-Bornu was to be more than just a soldier. It was to be a thread in a vast tapestry, one woven through faith, endurance, and empire. Every rider was both an instrument and a witness to the rhythm of conquest and survival. And yet, beneath the weight of prestige, the life they led was punishing. Horses were precious living gold, and each required care that rivaled the attention given to a child. Before a march, the riders would mix water with millet husks and salt, rubbing the mixture on the horses' flanks to keep their skin cool under the relentless sun. They plated the manes with special charms, small leather pouches filled with Quranic verses, iron dust, and crushed herbs meant to guard against evil. But no charm could ever truly block the searing heat. By mid-morning, the sun blazed without mercy. Armor grew heavy, tongues turned dry, and tempers became short. Riders learned to speak very little, conserving not just their words, but their strength. The desert demanded silence, and those who disobeyed it often paid dearly. Horses could collapse without warning. Men could too. And when one rider fell, the others would bury him quickly, marking the grave with a single upright spear before riding on. There was no glory in that moment, only duty. And yet, Even in this harsh reality, they found ways to hold dignity in their labor. Songs helped. Old riders taught new recruits low. Rhythmic chants meant to match the steady beat of the horse's hooves, a rhythm that was calm, a heartbeat of survival. They said this rhythm kept both man and beast alive. Food was simple and often scarce. They survived on millet cakes baked on flat stones, dates when the supply caravans caught up, and goat meat dried until it cracked like parchment. Water was measured in precious mouthfuls, with the commander's word deciding who would drink next. At night, they spread their sleeping cloths beside their horses, who served as warmth, an alarm system, and a constant companion. The smell of sweat and animal became indistinguishable from the smell of life itself. Their world revolved around the emir, the cavalry commander, man who carried the weight of both discipline and divine authority. His orders were absolute law. But even he knew the fragility of control in this environment. A single sandstorm could erase all direction, bury vital supplies, and scatter troops across miles of emptiness. The desert was both their battlefield and a relentless beast, entirely unpredictable and vast. Still, they pressed on because loyalty was survival. The Kanem-Bornu cavalrymen believed that dying under the Sultan's banner guaranteed a noble afterlife. And in that powerful belief, they found an endurance that went beyond the limits of the flesh. Their saddles were their thrones, their shadows their only witnesses. In the distance, the mirage would shimmer, sometimes showing trees that didn't exist, rivers that weren't there, or distant shapes that looked like enemies but would vanish as one approached. For a cavalryman, trusting your own eyes was a dangerous luxury. Trust was for faith, not for sight. Each rider carried a talisman tied around his wrist, a folded scrap of leather inked with protective prayers. But the truest shield, they said, was the discipline to remain calm when thirst, fear, and exhaustion tore at the edges of the mind. The Empire did not need heroes, it needed endurance. So much of Kanem-Bornu's might was carried on these backs to backs of men who were half warrior, half ghost. They returned home rarely, and when they did, they were celebrated like spirits returning from another world. Children would follow them through the villages, touching their dusty boots and horsetails for luck. Old women murmured blessings. Young men stared in awe, but the riders themselves would only bow quietly, their eyes still full of the distant horizon, because, for them, peace was a foreign concept, and the profound silence of the desert had already claimed their hearts. The desert does not sleep. It only changes its face from a sun that burns the skin by day to a silence that whispers madness by night. For the cavalrymen of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, this silence was their closest companion, their constant shadow. It wasn't just the searing heat or the immense distances that broke men out here. It was the waiting, the endless, hypnotic rhythm of hooves drumming over nothingness. Behind them, the dunes shifted and reformed, living mountains of sand erasing every trace that they had ever passed, as if the world itself was forgetting them in They called it the breathing land, and it truly felt alive. The desert seemed to sigh with the wind, expanding and contracting with the changing light, swallowing horizons whole before exhaling them again at dawn. When the wind rose, it didn't just carry dust. It carried voices. Sometimes they were familiar, child's distant laugh, a wife calling a name across 1,000 miles. Other times they were strange, ancient, and unsettling. The men learned quickly, you don't answer back, you just ride on. Each patrol was a journey into this void, lasting weeks at a time. The riders followed invisible routes, threads of memory connecting wells, remote trade posts, and the half-buried stones that marked the bones of older, forgotten empires. To an outsider, it would seem like pure madness to ride into such emptiness. But to the Kanem horsemen, these spaces were sacred. Every barren hill and shallow wadi held a memory, where a cousin once made a stand, where a friend fell and returned to the sand. This wasn't just a patrol. It was a pilgrimage through their own history. As dusk fell, the routine was a prayer in itself, a ritual that held the chaos at bay. They'd unsaddle their weary horses, rubbing them down with a mixture of dust and oil to protect their hides. Water was shared sparingly, each drop a jewel. A whispered prayer was offered to the fading horizon. Then the men would sit in a circle, their backs to the biting wind, listening to it sing its mournful song as it passed through their There were jokes, of course, because men in hard places always find a reason to laugh. Some said the wind could drive you mad. The old riders would say you could tell when a man was losing himself. He started talking to his horse like it was a priest, confessing his sins to the only one who would listen. But beneath the laughter, a quiet fear always lingered. In the profound silence of the desert night, even your own heartbeat felt impossibly loud, a frantic drum against the infinite quiet. To keep their minds sharp and their bodies awake during the long night watches, commanders told them to count the stars. The night sky was their map, not one drawn on paper, but one inherited through generations. The riders learned to read the heavens the way others read scriptures. The Southern Crown was a beacon that always pointed toward home. The constellation of the Lion guided them toward the great city of Bornu. For these men, the stars weren't just distant lights, they were ancestors, guides, and promises. A veteran of countless patrols, a man named Idrisu, once said, "The desert doesn't kill men, it erases them." And he was right. Out there, under the relentless sun and the cold, watching stars, the self slowly fades. You forget the vibrant color of the grasslands, the rich smell of the city markets. Your world shrinks, and you start to think only in the simplest terms: thirst, wind, and the next patch of shade. You stop speaking. You start listening to the whisper of the sand, to the steady breath of your horse, to the subtle way the stars shift from one hour to the next. Sometimes the mirages came early. The men called them gin-path shimmering streaks of silver on the horizon, showing impossible cities with gleaming towers or vast lakes that weren't there. They were tricks of the heat, phantoms born of light and hope. But hope can be a dangerous thing in the desert. A horseman once swore he saw Lake Chad shining like a mirror just ahead, even though they were hundreds of miles away. He rode toward it, possessed by the vision, until his horse collapsed from exhaustion. They found him the next morning, whispering prayers to a shimmering pool of dust. When a man vanished on patrol, no one asked how or why. The desert was both grave and God. You didn't question its will. You simply rode on, a little quieter, a little closer to your own shadow. In Kanem-Bornu, the horses were as precious as sons. Each had a name, a lineage, and a blessing spoken over it at birth. They were partners in this ordeal, not just beasts of burden. Some were even buried with their riders, wrapped in fine cloth, with millet and salt laid beside them for their journey into the next world. The horses, too, felt the madness of the patrols. They sensed mirages. They could smell death on the wind long before the men could. If a horse refused to move forward, a wise rider didn't force it. He understood the animal knew something he didn't. He would wait until the wind shifted, until the unseen danger had passed. By the silver light of the moon, the desert finally cooled, and the men found small comfort in their rituals. They sang low, soft songs, not for entertainment, but to remind themselves they were still alive, still human. The songs were half memory, half prayer, telling stories of cities made from red clay, of the sound of children's laughter, of women grinding millet back home. The rhythm was slow, hypnotic, like the distant rocking of camel bells on the far-off trade routes. At times, they would cross paths with others in the vast emptiness, traders from the Fezzan, their camels laden with salt, or fugitives fleeing conflict in the south. These encounters were always brief and tense. No one trusted anyone fully in the open desert. A wrong glance, a sudden move could ignite a raid. Yet, when they traded salt for dried meat, leather for a handful of dates, there was a shared understanding. For a single moment, they were not enemies or strangers, but ghosts who had taken human form, acknowledging each other's survival before melting back into the wasteland. And still, the madness crept closer with every passing day. Sleep was a light, strange thing, filled with dreams that felt too real, as if the ancestors were walking among them in the camp. Some riders would wake up shouting, claiming to have seen a figure of pure light walking ahead of the caravan. The older men called it the Desert Mother, a spirit said to guide lost travelers to water. But sometimes, they warned, she guided them to their deaths. There was a saying, when the dunes shift to suddenly at night, it means the dead are moving underneath. And if you hear your name whispered on the wind, you must never, ever answer. Because it isn't a friend calling for you. It's the desert testing your will to live. So, the cavalry learned that discipline was a form of survival. They followed rituals with absolute precision. Count the steps between wells, note the shape of every hill, never ride without your talisman. Each man carried a small leather pouch containing verses from holy texts, a lock of hair from a loved one, and sand from his Homer-fragile shield against the vast unseen world around him. But not every rider returned. The empire was immense, its borders stretching and contracting like a pair of lungs breathing in the wilderness. Patrols would sometimes disappear without a trace. When that happened, the Mai, the ruler, would send a priest to the edge of the desert. The priest would burn incense, its smoke curling into the sky, and say the words, "They have joined the horizon." Back in the capital, Bornu wives would sit by the city gates, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would never come. Children would play in the dusty streets, imitating cavalry charges with sticks for swords, not yet knowing the true price the desert took from their fathers. The silence of the desert teaches a strange kind of humility. To ride across it is to surrender to something far older than empires, something that measures time not in the reigns of kings, but in individual grains of sand. These cavalrymen carried messages, guarded the frontiers, and hunted down raiders. But their true purpose was something greater. They became witnesses to the sheer, terrifying scale of creation itself. And when dawn finally came, it felt like grace. The horizon would turn a soft violet, the air would cool for a fleeting moment, and the horses would lift their heads as if remembering that the world was still turning. The men would eat quietly a strip of dried meat, a handful of millet, a single, precious sip of water each. Then, without a word, they would rise, mount up, and ride again, following the long sun shadows that pointed the way toward home. Yet, in their eyes, something always lingered, the distant, quiet look of men who had seen the edge of the world and had returned, but not completely. The desert had carved their souls into stillness. It had stripped away their pride, their fear, and everything soft within them. What remained was pure endurance, that stubborn, quiet heartbeat of men who refused to vanish, even when everything around them did. That was the secret of Kanem-Bornu's riders. They were not made of glory or conquest. They were made of silence. The kind of silence that holds both death and devotion in equal measure. The desert had tried to break them. Instead, it made them part of its endless, timeless memory. For the riders of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, the edge of life was never far away. Every patrol across the vast, unforgiving desert was a test not just of endurance, but of courage, judgment, and the fragile thread separating survival from oblivion. The men who rode the Empire's borders knew this truth with every sunrise, every shifting dune, every whisper of wind that could hide a predator or reveal a mirage. They were a mix of young and old sons from villages along Lake Chad, heirs to horses that had carried generations across these same sands. Each rider carried more than a spear or a sword. He carried the weight of his family's honor and the expectations of his Mai, the ruler. A patrol was as much a ceremony as it was a duty, a ritual of courage that shaped a man's character while testing the very limits of his flesh. In the early hours, when the desert is still soft and the heat has yet to stake its claim, the riders set off. Their shadows stretch long over the sand, like fingers trying to grasp something eternal. They ride in measured intervals, one leading, one flanking, one guarding the rear, rhythm dictated by instinct and countless repetitions. Every hoofbeat is deliberate, every forward glance a careful calculation of the path ahead. The dangers were everywhere, and they were relentless. Raiders could emerge from the shimmering heat without warning, their camels kicking up clouds of sand to blind the unsuspecting. Lions roamed the peripheries of the desert, their roars at night serving as a chilling reminder that not all threats wore human faces. A horse could falter, its legs sinking into a soft dune, and a single misstep could plunge both rider and mount into peril. Disease, dehydration, and sheer exhaustion shadowed their every mile. The desert demanded respect, and it often exacted its tribute in blood and sweat. But glory was always intertwined with the danger. There were moments of pure triumph, like when a patrol returned unscathed after fending off a raid, having safeguarded a caravan laden with precious salt or gold. The Mai would reward them for their bravery, perhaps a new saddle, a fine horse, or a bolt of cloth dyed in the deepest indigo. Sometimes the reward was simpler, but just as meaningful. A whispered word of praise, a knowing smile from a commander who understood the peril they had faced. These small acknowledgments became the currency of their pride, the fuel that kept them riding. Even so, death was a constant companion. Some men simply vanished, swallowed without a trace by sudden, violent sandstorms. Others were felled by arrows in skirmishes that lasted mere minutes but felt like an eternity. Back in the villages along the lake, families would mourn, hanging small talismans at their doors to protect those who remained. Yet the riders accepted this fate as part of their calling. To serve the Empire was to walk a fine line between life and memory, a line as thin and sharp as the horizon at sunset. Courage alone was never enough. True survival depended on knowledge of the land, of the wind, and of the stars. The riders learned to read the dunes like ancient texts, interpreting each curve and shadow as a sentence written in sand. The patterns of wind-blown ridges, the direction of a migrating bird, the faint whisper of a distant oasisol were vital guides. The most skilled among them could sense danger before it arrived, their instincts honed to a razor's edge by months of isolation and perilous nights. Yet the mental strain often surpassed the physical. Days bled into nights, and nights into days, until time itself seemed to dissolve. The monotony of the endless desert became a silent torment, a test of sanity. Some men would whisper to their horses, finding solace in the presence of their loyal mounts. Others spoke quietly to themselves, their words lost to the wind. Sleep came only in brief, restless patches, often broken by nightmares of lost companions or visions of sand swallowing entire villages. The patrols demanded constant vigilance, but also a quiet surrender and acceptance that the desert could be as merciful as it was merciless. In this crucible of hardship, they formed bonds that transcended words. The brotherhood among the riders was forged not by choice, but by absolute necessity, sharing water, sharing the sliver of shade cast by a lone acacia tree, sharing the unspoken burden of fear. These acts became sacred rituals. A soldier who fell behind was never abandoned. If a man stumbled from exhaustion, the others would lift him onto a camel, whispering prayers and urging him onward. These simple yet profound gestures were what held the line between despair and resilience. When a patrol succeeded, the tales of their journey would spread back to the capital. Bornu, like rivers of fire, the Mai would hear of men who had navigated blinding sandstorms, outmaneuvered cunning raiders, and returned with their charges intact. These stories became legends, recounted at grand feasts where the millet wine flowed and drums echoed deep into the night. The riders' deeds were more than just practical feats. They were acts that reinforced the Empire's mythology, living proof of the Kanem-Bornu Cavalry's unmatched skill, discipline, and courage. Even in success, however, the desert remained the ultimate teacher. Every day offered new lessons in humility. Pride could blind a rider, leading him to misjudge the strength of an approaching storm or the cunning of an enemy. It was humility, patience, and a deep respect for the land that were the true currencies that carried men safely home. And so, the cavalryman learned to ride, not just for glory, but in a state of reverent silence, listening to the land. The wind, the steady pulse of their horses, and the murmurs of ancestors whispered through the sands. There were rituals to honor their survival. When a patrol returned, the men would perform rites to thank the spirits of the desert and their ancestors for their safe passage. They would pour a small libation of water onto the sand, whispering the names of those who were lost. Some would trace the patterns of the stars with their spears, recounting the constellations that had guided them through the vast, dark void. These quiet, personal acts created a rhythm, a sacred connection between the living and the memory of those who did not return. And finally, it was their profound sense of purpose that sustained them. They were not wandering aimlessly across the dunes. Every patrol defended the Empire's boundaries, protected the vital trade routes, and preserved the fragile order of the Kanem-Bornu state. Their difficult work allowed cities to flourish, markets to hum with the trade of gold and salt, and families to live in peace under the protection of law and legend. Theirs was an invisible but essential contribution, a legacy carved in dust, blood, and countless hoofprints. As night fell over the desert, the riders would set camp once more, their fires crackling against the immense silence. They would gaze up at the constellations that had guided them through the void, whispering stories of lost companions, of narrow escapes, and of deserts conquered not by strength alone, but by patience, intuition, and unwavering devotion. The wind carried these stories across the sands, ensuring that even in silence, the legacy of the Kanem-Bornu cavalry would endure. This was their life, lived between glory and death, life measured not in years, but in moments of courage, endurance, and silent triumph. The cavalrymen knew that they might never see another sunrise, yet they rode on anyway, carrying with them the weight of an empire, the pride of their skill, and the quiet knowledge that the desert remembers all those who honor it. And so, the riders slept lightly, always half awake, listening to the pulse of the desert. For, in the Kanem-Bornu Empire, survival was not a given, it was a ritual, a discipline, and a story passed down through hoofbeats and stars. sung softly to the timeless rhythm of the wind. In the vast, sun-drenched expanses of the Sahel, where empires rose and fell like the shifting dunes, the pulse of the Kanem-Bornu Empire was not measured in the beat of drums, but in the thunder of hooves. Long before the call to battle echoed across the plains, the empire's true strength, its very essence, was forged in the bond between man and horse. The story of Kanem-Bornu is a story of cavalry, a tale of how these magnificent animals, arriving on the winds of trade, reshaped a civilization. Imagine the great caravans winding their way across the Sahara, daring the immense void of sand and sky. They brought salt, silks, and spices, but their most precious cargo was alive. Horses, a gift from the north, traversed these ancient trade routes, their arrival heralding a new era for the peoples of Lake Chad. These were not just beasts of burden, they were engines of change. Their speed and stamina transformed the mobility of armies, turning slow-moving foot soldiers into a swift, formidable force. Warfare itself was redefined, becoming a fluid dance of charge and retreat, of power projected across vast distances with astonishing speed. The horse became the cornerstone upon which an empire's military might was built. The stables of the maize, the rulers of Kanem-Bornu, were far more than simple enclosures for animals. They were grand halls of prestige, symbols of imperial power and wealth. To step inside was to witness the heart of the empire's strength. Each horse was a masterpiece, meticulously selected for its strength, its unwavering endurance, and a fiery spirit that mirrored the landscape itself. These were not just animals, they were treasures, treated with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. They were bathed in fragrant oils that made their coats gleam and adorned with tack that was both functional and breathtakingly beautiful. Picture this: intricately embroidered saddlecloths, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the ochre earth. Imagine bronze ornaments, polished to a brilliant shine, catching the harsh African sun and glinting like captured stars. Each piece of equipment was a work of art, a testament to the skill of the empire's artisans and the high value placed on these noble creatures. Owning such a horse was a declaration of status, a visible sign of one's importance within the imperial hierarchy. But the relationship went far deeper than mere ownership. A rider and his horse were partners. A young cavalryman would spend years, from boyhood to manhood, in the saddle. He learned not just to ride, but to listen, to understand the subtle language of his mount. He learned to read the flicker of an ear, the tension in a muscle, the shift in a mood. He learned to coax a breathtaking performance, not with force, but with the slightest pressure of his knees, a soft word or a gentle touch. This was a quiet dialogue, a bond of trust forged over countless hours of shared hardship and triumph. The horse was a companion in solitude, a devastating weapon in battle, and a living symbol of a warrior's rank and honor. The rhythm of hoofbeats became the rhythm of his own heart. Training was the crucible where this powerful partnership was perfected. It was a spectacle of discipline and precision. On the dusty plains outside the capital, men and horses moved as one. They practiced in disciplined formations, wheeling and turning in perfect unison. They rehearsed the thundering charge that could shatter an enemy line, and the swift, controlled retreat that could lure a foe into a deadly trap. Every maneuver, honed through endless repetition, was designed for survival and dominance in the unpredictable theater of Sahelian warfare. The cavalryman's armor was a marvel of practicality. It was light enough for speed and agility in the searing heat, yet strong enough to offer real protection. Layers of tough leather were reinforced with plates of metal, designed to deflect a stray arrow or a spear thrust. Their shields, often circular and adorned with symbolic patterns, were an extension of their arm, used to parry and block in the chaotic swirl of close combat. The saddles and bridles, crafted by master leatherworkers and metalsmiths, were masterpieces of design, integrating beauty with battlefield function. The saddle provided a secure, stable seat for high-speed maneuvers, while the bridle allowed for precise communication and control. Even their clothing was a statement of both purpose and prestige. The men wore flowing robes, often dyed a deep, rich indigo color associated with wealth and power. Their heads were wrapped in long turbans, a practical necessity to shield their faces from the stinging sun and swirling sand, but also a mark of their identity as elite warriors of the Empire. Their feet were shod in sturdy leather boots, perfectly suited to the shifting sands and thorny. Every single element of their attire, from the glint of a bronze fitting to the wrap of a turban, signaled their dual role as practical soldiers and symbols of imperial authority. The enduring strength of Kanem-Bornu's cavalry was no accident. It was the result of a sophisticated and deeply ingrained tradition of horse breeding. This was not left to chance. The Empire maintained dedicated nurseries for foals, where the next generation of war horses was nurtured with expert care. Vast pastures were set aside for grazing, ensuring the herds remained healthy and strong. The knowledge of bloodlines, which sires produced the strongest offspring, which mares passed on the best temperament, was a closely guarded secret, passed down from master breeders to their apprentices through generations. This careful stewardship ensured that the imperial stables were always filled with mounts that possessed the vitality, intelligence, and spirit required for the rigors of desert life and warfare. This deep knowledge fostered an almost mystical bond between rider and horse. A seasoned cavalryman could sense his mount's mood before it was ever expressed. A subtle change in breathing, a slight unease, and in turn, the horse, a highly intelligent and sensitive animal, responded instantly to the faintest cues from its rider. A minute shift of weight, a gentle pressure from the legs, a change in the tone of voice, these were all that was needed to communicate complex commands in the heat of battle. This profound, unspoken trust was often the razor-thin margin between victory and defeat, between life and death. In the chaos of a skirmish, when shouts and the clash of steel filled the air, this silent conversation was what truly mattered. Life in the Sahel was a constant struggle against a harsh and unforgiving environment. It was a land of brutal extremes, blistering daytime heat, surprisingly cold nights, sudden, violent storms, and the ever-present threat of scarcity. And through it all, the horses of Kanem-Bornu carried their riders. They were the key to survival, the means of traversing a landscape that would break a man on foot. Every journey was a calculated risk, a careful plotting of a route from one source of water to the next. The arrival at an oasis or a waterhole was a sacred moment. The day's march would end, and a quiet ritual would unfold. The horses, parched and weary, would be led to the water first. They drank deeply, their powerful bodies replenished by the life-giving liquid. As they drank, their riders would often stand nearby, whispering quiet prayers of thanks, honoring the creatures that had borne them safely across another stretch of peril. They understood, in a way we can barely imagine, that to care for their horse was to care for their own life. The horse was not just an asset, it was a lifeline, an extension of the rider's own body, a partner in their shared journey through a dangerous world. This daily act of care reinforced the deep spiritual connection that defined the Kanem-Bornu cavalry. Ultimately, the horsemen of Kanem-Bornu were far more than just soldiers. They were living symbols of their empire's power and its vast reach. They were the swift messengers who carried the Mai's decrees across, hundreds of miles, the diplomats who projected his influence into distant territories, and the guardians who patrolled the frontiers, ensuring the safety of the trade routes that were the empire's lifeblood. They embodied a proud and ancient tradition, one that masterfully linked human skill, courage, and discipline with the raw, untamed grace of the animal world. It was on the strong backs of these magnificent horses that the ambitions and dreams of an empire were carried. Across shimmering dunes, through winding riverbeds, and over vast, sun-scorched plains, they rode. They were the image of Kanem-Bornu's might, a testament to a civilization that had mastered its environment by forging an unbreakable alliance with one of nature's most noble creatures. The echo of their hooves is the true history of Kanem-Bornu, a sound that tells a story of power, tradition, and a profound partnership between man and horse. Welcome back to our journey into the heart of the Kanem-Bornu Empire. Last time, we explored the foundations of their military might. Today, we're riding onto the battlefield itself to witness how this legendary cavalry turned warfare into an art form. Imagine this, the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the Sahel. The air is thick, not just with heat, but with anticipation. Suddenly, the ground begins to tremble. It starts as a low hum, a vibration you feel in your bones before you hear it. Then, the sound builds, a thunderous, rhythmic pounding. Dust rises in great, swirling clouds, catching the golden light of the sun, and through this haze they appear. Hundreds, then thousands of horsemen, a living river of steel and sinew, moving as one. This wasn't just a chaotic charge. It was a symphony of war, meticulously composed and flawlessly executed. The battlefield of Kanem-Bornu was a stage, and its cavalry were the master performers. Commands, rehearsed since boyhood, were called out, sharp and clear, cutting through the din. But these were no rigid textbook maneuvers. The cavalry's tactics were fluid, organic, built for the unpredictable nature of the desert. Speed, surprise, and the manipulation of perception were their greatest weapons. Think of a flock of birds, turning and wheeling in perfect unison. That was the Kanem-Bornu cavalry. They'd execute lightning-fast flanking maneuvers, appearing on an enemy's side when they were least expected. They'd launch sudden, ferocious charges that shattered enemy lines before they even had time to react. And they were masters of deception, employing feigned retreats to lure overconfident foes into cunningly laid traps. Every single motion was calculated, a chess move on a sandy board, designed to unsettle the enemy, break their morale, and secure a swift, decisive advantage. They didn't just fight the enemy, they played with their minds. At the very heart of this complex, deadly dance was a single, powerful instrument, the royal drum, the Kanem-Bornu. This wasn't just a drum. It was the voice of the empire, the pulse of its military machine. Its deep, resonant beat carried for miles across the open desert, a sound that was both a call to arms and a symbol of power. When the Kanem-Bornu sounded, soldiers would emerge from distant villages and fortresses, answering its call. Its rhythm dictated the flow of battle, signaling the moment to charge, the time to hold the line, or the signal for a strategic retreat. The sound resonated not just in the air, but in the spirit of every warrior. It connected the rider to his horse, the commander to his troops, and every single soldier to a singular, unified purpose. To hear that deep, rolling pulse was to feel the very heartbeat of the Kanem-Bornu Empire itself. It was a declaration that the Mai's will was present on the field, a tangible link to the center of their world. This drum was the conductor of their symphony of war, ensuring every instrument, every soldier, played their part in perfect harmony. In the chaos of battle, sound was a weapon, and the Kanem-Bornu cavalry were masters of acoustic warfare. Noise was just as strategic as silence. The sudden, sharp crack of a spear breaking against a shield, the high, piercing neigh of a war, the chilling clash of hundreds of blades meeting at once, these sounds were carefully orchestrated to intimidate their foes and embolden their allies. It was a psychological assault, a wall of sound designed to sow fear and confusion in the enemy ranks long before the first blow was even struck. But their strategy went far beyond just making noise. Their strength lay in coordinated motion, a testament to endless hours of training. Picture this, a line of cavalry galloping at full speed. The riders, so skilled they could fire a volley of arrows with deadly accuracy without breaking stride. Imagine them seamlessly forming a crescent, a horn formation designed to envelop and crush an enemy's flanks. Or watch as they suddenly break formation, reforming into a sharp wedge to pierce through the toughest defensive lines like a hot knife through butter. They used the desert itself as a strategic partner. They were born of this land, and they knew its secrets. Towering sand dunes weren't obstacles. They were mobile shields, hiding their numbers and movements until the perfect moment to strike. They would strategically position themselves near precious oases, controlling the water sources and, by extension, the enemy's movement and endurance. They even understood the winds, using them to carry smoke and dust across the sands to obscure their maneuvers, or to carry the sounds of their drums and war cries further, amplifying their terrifying presence. The desert wasn't just a location. It was an extension of their will, a tool they wielded with expert precision. This level of battlefield mastery didn't come from brute force alone. It required a combination of rigid discipline and brilliant improvisation. Before any engagement, scouts, the unsung heroes of the Empire, would fan out across the landscape. They were the eyes and ears of the army, mapping enemy movements, noting their numbers, and identifying their weaknesses. This vital intelligence would then be relayed back to the commanders by a network of relay riders, men who could carry information faster across the vast distances than any messenger on foot. This constant flow of information allowed the cavalry to be incredibly adaptive. They could adjust their plans on the fly, reacting to shifting conditions in real time. The Mai's advisors, his war council, were not just commanders, they were scholars of conflict. They meticulously analyzed patterns from past battles, learning which strategies ensured victory and which led to disaster. These lessons weren't just recorded in scrolls. They were passed down through generations, becoming the bedrock of their military doctrine. But this knowledge wasn't just theoretical. Soldiers internalized these tactics until they became second nature. Their bodies memorized the rhythms of a charge, the feel of a flanking maneuver, the muscle memory of firing an arrow from a galloping horse. They learned to react instinctively, their actions flowing from a place of deep, ingrained training long before their conscious minds could even process the command. It was this fusion of strategic intelligence and reflexive skill that made them such a formidable force. They were thinking warriors, but their bodies knew the art of war on a cellular level. Yet, to understand the Kanem-Bornu warrior, we must look beyond strategy and tactics. For them, war was more than just a physical contest. It was a sacred duty. A complex web of rituals and beliefs underpinned their entire military culture. Before a single spear was thrown, powerful oaths were sworn, binding each soldier's loyalty directly to the Mai. This wasn't just a promise. It was a sacred pact, with consequences not just in this life, but in the next. Rituals were performed to invoke divine protection. Horses, their partners in battle, were anointed with special oils and blessed. Spears and blades were consecrated, imbued with spiritual power. And as the army prepared to march, individual warriors would whisper prayers to spirits known and unknown, seeking courage and a favorable outcome. The battlefield was a place where the physical and spiritual worlds collided. And the Ngoma Bornu, that great royal drum, played a crucial role here as well. It was not merely a command tool, it was a spiritual anchor. Its beat was a connection to the divine, a rhythm that ensured the cohesion not just of men in formation, but of their collective courage and their shared moral compass. It reminded them of who they fought for and why. It was the sacred heartbeat that unified their individual spirits into one unbreakable will. In this context, the battlefield was transformed. It became more than just a place of violence and death. It was a living classroom. It taught the hard lessons of endurance, forcing a warrior to push beyond the limits of his body. It honed judgment, demanding split-second decisions where the wrong choice could mean annihilation. And, perhaps most importantly, it instilled a profound respect for the precarious balance between life and victory. Every campaign, every skirmish, every raid reinforced the interconnectedness of their core values: loyalty to the Mai, the skill of the warrior, and faith in the divine. It was this powerful trinity that fueled the Kanem-Bornu war machine. It's what allowed them to dominate the trade routes and landscapes of the central Sahel for centuries. They weren't just soldiers. They were custodians of a sacred tradition, fighting not just for land or riches, but for the very soul of their empire. In the heart of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, a fundamental truth resonated across the vast desert sands. No empire, no matter how mighty, could endure without allegiance. For the legendary Cavalry, this wasn't just a matter of political convenience. It was a sacred bond, a covenant that tied the rider to their leader, the Mai, in a way that went far beyond mere obedience. This was a loyalty woven into the very fabric of their spiritual and social existence. To swear fealty to the Mai was to pledge not only your sword and your life, but your very soul. It was a bond that transcended self-interest, a promise that held sway in both the physical world and the spiritual realm. To betray the Mai wasn't just an act of treason, it was seen as a defiance of celestial law itself. The consequences were not just tangible punishment, exile, or death, they were spiritual, a stain upon one's honor that could echo through eternity. The oath-taking ceremonies were events of profound solemnity, etched into the memory of every warrior. Imagine the scene: rows of proud cavalrymen, the desert sun glinting off their armor, kneeling on the warm sand. Their hands are raised to the vast open sky, their spears held upright, pointing towards the heavens. As they kneel, the Empire's elders, their voices raspy with the wisdom of generations, would recite ancient words, weaving a narrative that linked the Empire's authority directly to a divine mandate. The air would be thick with reverence and the weight of history. Each rider's pledge was made not in isolation, but in the presence of their comrades. This public declaration served a powerful purpose. It bound them together, transforming them from individual soldiers into an unbreakable brotherhood. This was a fraternity forged in ritual, tested in battle, and extending across the endless expanse of the desert. These were ties that would ensure cohesion in the deafening chaos of a charge, inspire unwavering trust in moments of crippling uncertainty, and foster a shared, unspoken understanding of what honor truly meant. This loyalty wasn't simply demanded, it was cultivated, nurtured, and reinforced through a sophisticated system of reward and ritual. A successful campaign didn't just mean victory for the Empire, it brought tangible rewards for the warriors. The Mai would bestow recognition, lavish gifts of cloth, salt, or horses, and grant a level of social prestige that elevated a rider and his family within the Empire's hierarchy. Glory was a powerful motivator, and the cavalry of Kanem-Bornu knew that their valor would be seen and celebrated. But the system also demanded accountability. Failure was not met with arbitrary punishment, but with a process of reflection. Sometimes it required penance, a ritual to cleanse the spirit and restore balance. Always it demanded accountability. The warriors understood with stark clarity that their personal fortunes, their wealth, their status, their very lives were inseparable from the fate of the empire. A victory for Kanem-Bornu was a victory for them all. A defeat was a shared burden. Over time, the most devoted and successful cavalry units became the stuff of legend. Their names weren't just recorded in dusty scrolls. They were etched into the living oral histories of the people. Their deeds were praised in epic songs, sung under the canopy of 1,000,000 desert stars. Their stories passed down from parent to child. They became exemplars of duty, courage, and unwavering loyalty, their legacies serving as a guiding light for generations of warriors to come. They were the immortal heroes of the empire, their fame echoing through the centuries. Equally important to this framework of loyalty was its deep spiritual dimension. The life of a Kanem-Bornu cavalryman was steeped in belief. These were not just soldiers. They were men of faith, navigating a world where the spiritual and the material were one. Before a patrol or a battle, they wouldn't just check their saddles and sharpen their spears. They would perform sacred rites, invoking protection and guidance from the divine. Many soldiers carried talismans, small objects, blessed by holy men, believed to ward off harm and grant strength. These weren't mere superstitions. They were physical manifestations of faith, a source of profound psychological comfort in the face of mortal danger. The horses, their indispensable partners in life and war, were also part of this spiritual contract. Riders would bless their mounts, whispering prayers to ensure their swiftness, endurance, and safety. This ritual care forged an almost mystical bond between man and animal. In the worldview of Kanem-Bornu, the line between politics and belief was beautifully, purposefully blurred. Allegiance to the Mai wasn't just a political act, it was an alignment with the cosmic order. The Mai was seen as a divinely appointed guardian, and serving him was to serve the greater good, to help maintain the balance of the universe. In the harsh and unpredictable environment of the Sahel, disorder in the desert was a terrifying prospect. It mirrored a potential for chaos in life itself. Loyalty to the empire was a way of imposing order, of creating a stable, predictable world in a land defined by its extremes. Therefore, to understand the cavalry of Kanem-Bornu, we must see it as more than just a military institution. It was a complete social and spiritual framework that structured society. Its members were far more than just warriors. They were diplomats sent on missions to distant courts. They were expert caretakers of their precious horses, possessing knowledge passed down through generations. And above all, they were the vessels of the empire, the living embodiment of its power, its faith, and its endurance. The rigorous discipline, the meticulous training, and the unshakable loyalty they embodied were the cornerstones that allowed the Kanem-Bornu Empire to survive for centuries, thriving in a landscape that was as breathtakingly beautiful as it was relentlessly perilous. Picture the end of a long day. The sun, a fiery orb, dips below the horizon, painting the desert sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. The cavalry units return to their encampments, the rhythmic drumming of hooves slowing to a gentle walk. The air, once filled with the dust and clamor of training exercises, grows still and cool. The riders dismount, their first thoughts not for themselves, but for their horses. They lead their mounts to water, groom their coats, and ensure they are resting comfortably. As twilight settles, small fires begin to flicker to life across the camp, casting dancing shadows against the dunes. Around these fires, the warriors gather. The formality of the day gives way to the easy camaraderie of the evening. Here stories are shared tales of past battles, humorous anecdotes from the day's ride, lessons learned from a near miss, or a moment of insight. Respect, which was demonstrated through formal salutes during the day, is now reaffirmed through shared laughter and quiet conversation. It was in these quiet, unguarded moments, away from the clash of spears and the watchful eyes of commanders, that the true nature of their bond became most apparent. Here you could feel the depth of their commitment, not just to the Mai, but to each other. You could sense the profound weight of their duty, a responsibility they carried not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. And you could witness the incredible intimacy of their brotherhood, a connection forged in shared hardship, shared faith, and a shared dream of a secure and prosperous empire. The cavalry's unwavering discipline, their profound reverence for their mounts, and their unshakable, multi-layered loyalty were the engine that powered the Kanem-Bornu Empire. These elements ensured that the empire could not only survive, but thrive, navigating the turbulent currents of time with the steady, rhythmic pulse of hooves across the sand. They were an institution guided by the stars above, anchored by a deep and abiding faith, and sustained, always, by a sacred sense of honor. The desert is not dead. It breathes slowly, deeply, like a giant asleep beneath the sands. Each sunrise over the lands of Kanem-Bornu was a reminder that the empire itself was built upon this restless creature. The dunes moved in silence, reshaping the world overnight. Paths that were there yesterday vanished. Wells that were a lifeline disappeared beneath waves of gold. Even the most experienced riders could wake to find themselves utterly lost in a landscape that refused to stay still. For the cavalrymen of Kanem-Bornu, survival was a matter of reading the desert's moods, the subtle tilt of a dune, the taste of the air, the whisper of wind that carried grains of sand like tiny, stinging messengers across their faces. To them, the Sahel was both mother and monster, nurturing in the rare moments of shade and water, and merciless in her endless hunger. The desert taught humility above all else. A warrior could master his spear, command his horse with a thought, and memorize every constellation in the sky, yet a single sandstorm could scatter his troop, and erase his very existence from the world. The elders told stories of the demon of the south wind, a spirit said to wander the dunes at dusk, calling men by name in the familiar voices of their mothers. Those who answered its call vanished into the shifting mirages, swallowed by the earth before the next dawn. But beyond the myths, there was the hard truth of endurance. The cavalrymen learned to move with the desert's rhythm. They learned to rest at high noon when the heat shimmered like liquid glass, and to ride by moonlight when the air finally cooled and the stars blazed like 1,000 distant campfires overhead. They followed routes invisible to outsiders, not marked by stones or flags, but by memory, tradition, and the faint, ghostly lines of dried salt where ancient rivers once flowed. Each oasis along their path was a story in itself. Some were no larger than a few lonely palms huddled around a pool of muddy water. Others, like the great hubs of Bilma and Kowar, pulsed with the lifeblood of an empire. They were vibrant centers of trade and rumor, where merchants from Bornu, the Hausa towns, and even far-off Tripoli mingled. Here, they exchanged not just salt and other goods, but secrets that could build or break kingdoms. The cavalrymen guarded these precious arteries of the empire, for they knew a simple, brutal truth. Whoever controlled the wells controlled the world. A single poisoned well could bring down an entire army. A hidden one could save it. In the profound silence of those nights, when the horses slept standing and the sand finally cooled beneath their feet, the soldiers often spoke of the desert as a living god, unpredictable, yet terrifyingly consistent in her power. They swore that if you pressed your ear to the ground at midnight, you could hear her breathing. Some said it was just the sound of the earth shifting, settling for the night. Others claimed it was the collective whisper of the spirits of the lost, those who had perished out here without water or a name to be remembered by. Among the cavalry's most sacred rituals was a quiet prayer, whispered just before the dawn. Patrol set out. May the sand not rise against us. May the wells remember our faces. May the wind carry us home. This wasn't just a plea. It was an acknowledgement of their place in this vast, unforgiving world. The desert tested the Empire as much as any invading army ever could, and the kings of Kanem-Bornu knew this intimately. That's why their greatest roads were not paved with stone, but mapped with memory. These were paths that wound between wells, caravan stations, and fortified rest camps known as rabbies. Each rabbi was a small pocket of human defiance against the endless sander clay-walled outpost, where soldiers watered their horses, shared bowls of millet porridge, and carved their names into the heavy timber beams before continuing their journey into the vastness. They were fragile, temporary marks of existence in a land that sought to erase everything. At night, the desert would come alive again in a different way. The dunes, which had been still and silent under the brutal sun, began to hum. It was a low, eerie vibration known even today as singing sand. The cavalryman said it was the earth murmuring the names of the fallen. When that strange, mournful sound rose from the ground, they would tighten their cloaks, check their waterskins one more time, and whisper small blessings into the ears of their horses, their partners in survival. To the untrained eye, the desert was pure chaos, a meaningless expanse of heat and sand. But to these men, it was a map written in rhythm. They read the direction of the wind, the lean of the sparse acacia trees, the seasonal migration of birds, and the subtle texture of the sand underfoot. Each grain had meaning, and that was how Kanem-Bornu survived, by turning the very thing that destroyed others into its first and most formidable line of defense. The Empire's enemies often underestimated the desert's allegiance. Armies from the Hausa kingdoms, from Fezzan, or the Tuareg confederations who dared to invade through those plains often found themselves swallowed. Long before they ever reached Bornu's heartland, some retreated in a panic, their morale shattered. Others simply perished quietly, their proud banners buried under shifting dunes, their bones left to bleach beside the carcasses of their camels. The Kanem-Bornu cavalrymen, meanwhile, would return home like ghosts of the dunes silent, their skin blackened by the sun, their spirits unbroken. Their true strength wasn't in their armor or their swords, but in their incredible patience. They could wait for weeks beside a single well, perfectly hidden behind sand ridges, watching an enemy force dehydrate to death miles away, a slow, inevitable victory delivered by the land itself. The desert also shaped their minds. The prolonged, absolute silence bred a strange kind of wisdom. It's true, some men went mad from it, hearing phantom voices in the wind, seeing ghostly riders galloping just beyond their reach. But others found a profound peace in the emptiness, saying that it stripped away all distractions and revealed the heart's true sound. The poets of Kanem-Bornu, especially those who came from cavalry families, often compared the desert to prayer, vast, still, and filled with the echoes of one's own deepest fears and hopes. One of their verses captures this perfectly. He who knows the dune knows silence. He who knows silence knows his name. In that stillness, an empire could truly listen, not just to the sound of hooves or the clang of armor, but to the deep, ancient pulse of geography itself. The kings of Kanem-Bornu built their strategies upon this listening. They placed their forts not where the soil was most fertile, but where the wells sang with life. They measured true power not by the number of soldiers in an army, but by how long a single troop could survive without shade. Even the flow of trade bowed to this rhythm. Great caravans carrying salt, gold, and leather moved only according to the advice of Bornu's desert scoutsmen, who could smell a storm days before it arrived, who knew the secret language of the land. In return for their knowledge, these scouts were treated with near religious respect. It's said some were buried with their compasses and waterskins, their graves marked only by small piles of white stones that shimmered like the backs of lizards under the relentless sun. To live in Kanem-Bornu was to understand that every single heartbeat was borrowed from the desert. The same winds that carried the cavalry home could just as easily erase their memory forever. That was why the empire learned to build endurance, not monuments. Even the grand palaces of Engazagamu, the later capital, were made of earth designed to blend with the soil, not to defy it, destined to one day return to it. So when we say the desert breathed, it isn't just poetry. It was a fundamental truth. Its breath fed the wells. Its size carved the dunes. Its immense silence became the very rhythm of a kingdom that lasted for 1,000 years. The Night Riders of Kanem-Bornu knew this better than anyone. They did not just survive the desert, they learned to breathe with it. And in doing so, they became part of something eternal, a heartbeat felt only under the endless sky, where sand meets star, and silence tells the oldest story of all. Empires fall for many reasons: greed, arrogance, exhaustion, but the Kanem-Bornu Empire did not die easily. It adapted, and that was its genius. Across the centuries, as the sands shifted and droughts tested every living thing, the empire reinvented itself again and again. It moved its heart, reshaped its borders, and absorbed its enemies until those enemies became its strength. Kanem-Bornu was not an empire carved in stone. It was an empire carved in wind. When the rains failed and Lake Chad shrank like a closing eye, the people did not curse the gods. They packed their saddles, gathered their herds, and followed the water's retreat. Their kings, called Maya, title meaning the one who knows, led migrations that spanned generations. The seat of power itself, once fixed in the region of Kanem, eventually shifted westward to Bornu. But the spirit of the empire never changed. It simply adjusted its rhythm to the new song of the land. This mobility was the empire's secret weapon. Where other kingdoms saw movement as weakness, Kanem-Bornu saw it as renewal. The cavalry that once defended trade routes now guided entire communities across the plains. Their spears not for war, but for marking paths through the sand. The horses that once thundered into battle now pulled wagons of grain and water, their hooves beating the same ancient rhythm of endurance. And when they reached new lands, the empire absorbed what it found. The Kanem-Bornu people mingled with the people of Bornu, creating new dialects, new traditions, and even new gods to pray to when the horizon turned dark. The empire's scholars welcomed foreign clerics from Egypt and the Fezzan, learning new systems of law and literacy. By the time of the great Idris Aluma in the late 16th century, Kanem-Bornu had become a fusion of desert resilience and Sahelian diplomacy, an empire built not on dominance, but on adjustment. Aluma himself was a master of this philosophy. He reformed the army to include muskets acquired through trade with the Ottoman Empire, built stronger fortresses along the southern borders, and encouraged Islam not through conquest, but through example. Under his reign, the empire flourished. Its markets were alive with horses, salt, and scholars. Its mosques echoed with prayers that rose like dust at dawn. Adaptation was not just political, it was spiritual. When a devastating drought swept across the region and the wells of Kanem ran dry, the priests and astronomers read the signs in the stars. They declared that the empire's spirit must move west, following the path of renewal. Rather than resist, the people obeyed. It was as though the empire itself understood that survival was not found in defiance, but in listening. This instinct to bend rather than break made Kanem-Bornu one of Africa's longest-lasting empires, surviving for nearly a millennium through war, famine, and dramatic shifts in global trade. It's easy for us to admire the courage of its horsemen or the beauty of its manuscripts, but the real brilliance lay in something much quieter: its ability to change without losing itself. The Bornu of later centuries was not the same as the Kanem of the past, yet the heartbeat was the same. The same drums called men to prayer. The same laws guided trade and marriage. The same old desert routes, once battlefields, became arteries of peace. This adaptation also demanded humility. When Lake Chad withdrew, the empire did not pretend to command it back. Instead, the people built canals and irrigation systems along its new edges. They accepted that water, not gold or kingship, was the real ruler of the Sahel. And when foreign traders brought new goods and strange ideas, Kanem-Bornu did not close its gates. It opened its markets wider. Egyptian linen, Moroccan swords, Ottoman guns all found homes beside the empire's own iron tools and woven mats. The desert's silence became a meeting ground for the world. But this constant adaptation came at a cost. Identity was always in motion. The Kanembu tongue slowly blended with the languages of their neighbors. Old shrines were replaced by mosques. The cavalry's once sacred songs faded into legend. Yet, even in that loss, there was continuity, for even when the words changed, the rhythm remained. The rhythm of survival. The rhythm of a people who understood that permanence was an illusion in a land where even the dunes never stayed still. In many African traditions, to survive is to remember not through monuments, but through motion. Kanem-Bornu embodied that philosophy. Its people carried their knowledge not in stone libraries, but in their songs, their migrations, and their adaptability. When a new ruler rose, he was expected not to rebuild the past, but to reinterpret it, to find a delicate balance between memory and necessity. This balance shaped their diplomacy as well. The empire forged alliances across ethnic lines, integrating the Kitoko, Hausa, Tabu, and other neighboring peoples. Instead of destroying them, Kanem-Bornu wove them into its tapestry. Each tribe contributed its own wisdom: the Kitoko's fishing expertise, the Tabu's desert navigation, the Hausa's market acumen. The result was a living mosaic, an empire that breathed as one organism, expanding and contracting like lungs beneath the desert sun. Even in its decline, Kanem-Bornu remained dignified. When European colonial explorers arrived centuries later, they found not ruins, but remnants of continuity. They found people still calling themselves Bornu, still telling stories of the Great Maze, still tracing their ancestry to the riders who once crossed the desert by starlight. In the end, adaptation was more than a strategy for Kanem-Bornu. It was faith. Faith that the land would provide another path, another well, another dawn. And so, when we look back on this empire today, we are not just seeing the bones of an old power. We are witnessing a masterclass in survival, a civilization that taught the world how to listen, how to bend, and how to begin again. Because in Africa, the strongest do not conquer the land, they learn to move with it. In a land of sand and silence, faith became the only fortress that could never crumble. When the rains failed, when kings fell, when the horses' hooves grew tired, belief held the world together. Long before the first mosque rose from the dust, the people of Kanem-Bornu already understood reverence. Their ancestors had looked to the stars and spirits, to the ancestors who rode invisibly beside them. The desert itself was a temple, its wind, a kind of prayer. But when Islam arrived, carried across the Sahara by traders and scholars, it did not erase the old ways. It blended with them, like water sinking into parched soil, invisible but transforming everything it touched. At first, the new faith came in whispers on the lips of merchants resting at wells, or scholars from Fezzan reciting verses under the flickering light of an oil lamp. They spoke of one God, unseen but infinite, and a book whose words had traveled from the Arabian sands to every corner of the world. For the rulers of Kanem-Bornu, this was more than religion. It was a connection, a bridge between the lonely vastness of the Sahel and the bustling cities of Cairo, Mecca, and Timbuktu. The early kings, the Mays, were cautious. They saw how powerful belief could be. A kingdom that prayed together could march together. And so they embraced Islam not as a foreign imposition, but as a unifying rhythm. It was a rhythm of law, of literacy and diplomacy tools that strengthened the empire's reach across the desert. In the 11th century, during the reign of Muhammad, the court began to favor Islamic scholars and clerics. The ulama, the learned men of Islam, became royal advisors, writing letters to distant caliphs and teaching the sons of nobles how to read Arabic. Yet, even as the call to prayer echoed across the dunes, ancestral rituals continued. Warriors still tied charms beneath their armor for protection. Farmers still whispered to the earth before planting their seeds. The gods of old did not vanish, they simply stepped aside, their echoes absorbed into the poetry of the Quran. Kanem-Bornu's genius lay in this balance. Faith was never wielded as a weapon, but as a thread, binding the many tongues and tribes under one divine horizon. As the centuries passed, the mosques became more than places of prayer. They became centers of diplomacy. A letter sealed in Bornu could reach Cairo within weeks, carried by camel caravans that followed the ancient trade arteries. And within these messages flowed gold, greetings, and treaties. Faith gave the empire a passport entry into a vast, interconnected network of Muslim states stretching from Morocco to Mali, from Fezzan all the way to the Nile. By the time of my Idris Aluma in the 16th century, Islam had become the very soul of statecraft. Aluma, a truly visionary ruler, built mosques of baked earth in every major town. He ordered his soldiers to perform their daily prayers, even during military campaigns, and made the pilgrimage to Mecca a royal duty. Yet, even in his devotion, there was strategy. Religion was the language of legitimacy. To be a Muslim ruler was to be seen, respected, and connected. It was through Islam that Bornu could trade more deeply, marry more strategically, and rule more righteously. Faith became armor, not the kind that deflected arrows, but the kind that held the spirit upright. Even the architecture of faith mirrored the desert's humility. The mosques were not made of marble or stone, but of sun-baked clay. Their walls breathed with the seasons, swelling in the rains, drying in the heat. Their minarets rose like termite mounds, blending seamlessly into the landscape. When the call to prayer sounded, it didn't echo through towering cities, but across open plains, mingling with the calls of birds and the lowing of cattle. To pray in Kanem-Bornu was to face the same sun that scorched your skin, to bow to the same dust that carried your footprints home. Faith wasn't distant, it was intimate. The desert became the first mosque, the wind its eternal muezzin. This fusion of the sacred and the practical made Islam in Bornu something unique. It was unimposed from above, nor was it detached from the earth. It became woven into the rhythm of trade, justice, and war. Contracts were sealed in the name of Allah. Armies carried banners inscribed with verses from the Quran. Judges quoted both Quranic law and ancient ancestral wisdom. The empire's identity wasn't divided. It was layered like sand dunes, shaped by many different winds. Faith also became a map of belonging. When the empire shifted its center westward, its mosques marked the path like milestones of memory. Every prayer, every fast, every verse recited in the blistering heat was an act of endurance, a statement that even in the harshest of lands, God's presence could be felt. But perhaps the most profound gift of Islam to Kanem-Bornu was education. From small Quranic schools grew great centers of learning. Children memorized scripture, learned arithmetic, and copied manuscripts on smooth wooden boards. Scholars debated law, astronomy, and poetry under the shade of acacia trees. Through them, the empire found not just power, but purpose, the conviction that knowledge was itself a form of devotion. To learn was to praise, to teach was to build, and to remember was to survive. Faith, like the empire itself, learned to adapt, carried in the hearts of riders, echoed in the silence of wells, and whispered into the ears of newborns as blessings. Even when Bornu's borders eventually faded, the prayers remained. Even when kingdoms rose and fell, the call still sounded faint, but eternal. And so, when the last Mai rode into the twilight of empire, the fortress that remained was not of clay or of gold, but of words, verses carried from father to son, teacher to student, wanderer to home. Faith was Kanem-Bornu's greatest adaptation, a fortress built not on stone, but on belief. A promise whispered in every direction. We may move, we may change, we may fade, but we will never be lost. The might of the Kanem-Bornu Empire was unjust forged in the courage of its soldiers or the genius of its kings. It rested squarely on the shoulders of a powerful and disciplined class, the masters of men and horses. These were no ordinary warriors. They were the elite commanders, descended from lineages stretching back to the earliest campaigns of the Kanembu kings. To be born into one of these semi-noble families was to inherit not only prestige, but a lifetime of sacred obligation. From childhood, they were raised with a single, unshakable truth. A man's worth is measured by how well he commands both men and beasts. Imagine the sun rising over the Sahel, casting long shadows across a vast training ground. Dust swirls as riders circle in perfect unison, their horses snorting in the cool morning air, flags snapping crisply in the wind. This was the world of the commanders, a world built on legacy. Each family meticulously maintained scrolls, or passed down oral genealogies that traced their ancestry to a founding warrior who rode beside the earliest Mai. Their homes weren't in the bustling heart of the capital, but on its outskirts, close enough to hear the royal drum's summons. Their compounds were living museums of martial history, lined with saddles, bridles, and the hides of war horses long gone. To outsiders, these men were nobles, but to their own kin, they were custodians of memory. Every son of a commander was expected to master horse riding before he turned 10, to learn the arts of weapon care, and to recite the empire's codes of loyalty by heart. The women played a crucial role, too. Daughters were often skilled in managing the stables and trading horses, the quiet, essential work that fueled the cavalry's legendary efficiency. The wealth of these families wasn't measured in gold or land, but in hoofbeats. Owning 10 war horses was an honor. Owning 50 meant you had influence. But the most revered commanders owned entire pastures, lush green islands in the arid Sahel where prized horses were fed on millet stalks and watered from deep, heavily guarded wells. Before a commander ever led his men into battle, he had to undergo a profound ceremony, the ritual of the stirrup. This wasn't just a military promotion, it was a spiritual anointing. In the presence of the Mai's herald, the young commander would kneel beside his chosen horse. An elder would recite a prayer, invoking the spirits of Kanem-Bornu's ancestors. Then, the commander would dip his fingers into a bowl of ash mixed with salt, symbols of endurance and preservation, and smear it on the horse's forehead. As he placed his foot in the stirrup for the first time as a commander, the onlookers would chant a powerful blessing. May your shadow never fall before your horse, may it always fall behind. It was a reminder to lead with courage, not with fear. From that moment on, his horse was more than an animal. It was his soul's companion, a living reflection of his discipline, his bravery, and the favor of the spirits. If a commander's horse faltered in battle, it was whispered that the spirits were displeased with his heart. Within Kanem-Bornu's military, the chain of command was strict, almost sacred. This was the hierarchy of the hooves. At the very top were the Mai's personal commanders, the Kapkanawa, which means those who speak with the Mai's breath. They oversaw massive regiments, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Each Kokinawa had deputies responsible for discipline, supplies, and intelligence, ensuring the army moved as one cohesive unit. Below them were the clan commanders. These men led units composed mostly of soldiers from their own family or allied villages. This created an incredible bond. These commanders knew their soldiers. Personally, they trained together, they prayed together, and when the time came, they often died together. This intimate connection fostered a fierce, almost familial loyalty that was nearly impossible to break. At the base of the command structure were the field captains, often young men eager to prove their worth. Many had risen from the ranks of the common cavalry, for in Kanem-Bornu, promotion was earned through valor and loyalty. Not just by birthright, a common soldier who saved his commander's life in the heat of battle might one day find himself commanding others. This unique blend of nobility and meritocracy gave the army of Kanem-Bornu a rare and powerful balance. It was disciplined yet dynamic, traditional yet adaptable. Every dawn, the capital, Engazagamu, echoed with the thunder of hooves. On the open plains nearby, the training grounds came alive. Dust rose like morning incense as riders galloped in tight circles, practicing intricate formation maneuvers and terrifying mock charges. The air smelled of iron, sweat, and dry grass. Trainers, often retired veterans, with faces and backs mapped with the scars of old battles, barked orders with gravelly authority. Children scurried about, carrying buckets of water for the horses and oil for the weapons, learning the rhythms of war from a young age. The commanders supervised every single detail, from the precise way a man mounted his horse to how he dismounted. A sloppy rider was a liability, a danger not just to himself, but to his brothers. The horses themselves underwent rigorous training. The best were taught to respond to whistles and subtle shifts in their rider's weight, not just the reins. It was said that a Kanem-Bornu warhorse could dance through a hail of arrows not because it was fearless, but because it trusted its master completely. Loyalty was the currency of the empire, and the Mai rewarded it generously. After every major campaign, the victorious commanders would ride before the palace for the ceremony of spoils. The Mai, seated beneath a vibrant red canopy, would toss golden bangles or bolts of expensive imported silk to his loyal warriors. But the true prize wasn't gold. It was the right to govern a tract of land known as a fief. A commander granted a fief would collect taxes, maintain local order, and ensure the military readiness of his region, extending the Mai's authority across the vast empire. This system kept the empire stable for centuries. A commander's loyalty was rooted not just in faith, but in a very real economic stake. Betrayal meant more than just dishonor. It meant the loss of generations of accumulated wealth and status. Even in peacetime, these men remained vigilant, guarding trade routes, protecting pilgrims, and acting as the silent, powerful hand of the Mai in distant provinces. Before each campaign, the commanders would gather in a sacred, circular stone building outside Engazagamutha, Great Hall of the Drum. Here, they would place their hands upon the bronze rim of the royal drum, the Kanem-Bornu, and swear a binding oath. If I falter, may the sand take me. If I betray the Mai, may my horse throw me before my enemies. This was both an oath and a curse, binding not only the man, but his entire lineage. Their sons grew up knowing that the honor of their ancestors lived or died with them on the battlefield. Legends abound of commanders who, facing capture, chose to kill their own beloved horses before falling on their swords, believing it was better to die a servant of the Mai than to live as a slave of shame. In the quiet evenings, after the horses were fed and the men dismissed, the commanders would gather by fires outside their compounds. They would smoke long pipes, drink millet beer, and tell stories of past campaigns. This wasn't boastful talk, but a solemn act of remembrance. They spoke of the Battle of the Black Dune, where a handful of men held off hundreds of my Idris Aluma's legendary campaigns across Lake Chad, when Kanem-Bornu's banners flew higher than ever before. And they spoke of the countless unnamed soldiers whose unyielding loyalty formed the empire's very foundation. Their pride wasn't loud or arrogant. It was like the deep heat shimmering beneath the desert sand scene, but always present. They knew the empire's survival depended on them, but they also understood its fragility. Every rebellion, every drought, every lost horse was a stark reminder that even the mightiest empire could be humbled by the desert's unforgiving breath. To be a commander was to carry the weight of hundreds of lives. The lives of men who entrusted you with their fate, and the lives of horses that mirrored your own courage and fear. The masters of men and horses understood that true loyalty wasn't blind obedience. It was a disciplined, delicate balance between fear, faith, and profound responsibility. So when the call of war echoed across the dunes, they rose without hesitation. They mounted their horses, adjusted their spears, and tightened their cloaks against the desert wind. Because, for them, every dawn was a summons, and every hoofbeat was a heartbeat of the empire. To truly understand the soul of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, you have to understand its king, the Mai. He was so much more than a ruler. In the eyes of his people, he was the sun around which all of life revolved, the divine center of order in a world of dust, drought, and constant war. His very presence shaped the rhythm of the cavalry's hooves, the booming of the royal drums, and the courage of the men who followed him into the jaws of the desert. When the Mai stood before his army, a profound silence would fall like a heavy curtain. The horses would stop stamping their feet. Even the wind itself seemed to hold its breath and listen. To look upon the Mai in his full regalia, flanked by his commanders, bathed in fragrant incense and shimmering gold light, was to glimpse something that felt halfway between mortal man and living myth. The Kanem-Bornu worldview saw the Mai as the living axis between heaven and earth. He wasn't just born into power. He was chosen by the ancestors, anointed through ancient, sacred rites that masterfully blended spiritual belief with sharp political genius. Every single decision, whether to march to war, move the capital city, or bless the coming harvest, was framed as divine will made visible through him. The royal chronicles stated it plainly: as long as the Mai breathes, the land breathes. When his breath ceases, the winds turn against us. He sat at the symbolic heart of cosmic balance. The empire's prosperity, the fertility of its fields, and even the legendary endurance of its war horses were all believed to flow directly from his favor. Commanders would kneel before him not only as subjects bowing to their king, but as guardians of his divine reflection. Their unflinching discipline on the battlefield was an act of worship. A perfectly timed choreography meant to maintain harmony between the heavens above and the dust beneath their hooves. On the eve of a great war, a sacred fire was lit in the inner courtyard of the palace. This was a ritual so holy that only the Mai, his high priest, and the royal cavalry commanders were permitted to witness it. It was known as Karan Mai, the night of the king's fire. This wasn't an ordinary flame. It was fed with 7 sacred oils, each one representing a divine virtue: endurance, loyalty, wisdom, restraint, courage, mercy, and justice. As the fire blazed, the Mai stood before it in absolute silence. His robes shimmered with intricate bronze embroidery, and his head was wrapped in pure white cloth, a powerful symbol of clarity and divine authority. One by one, the commanders led their magnificent horses forward. The high priest would dip a feather into one of the sacred oils and brush it gently along each horse's forehead, whispering blessings in both the Kanem-Bornu and Arabic languages: ride as thunder rides, strike as light strikes, return as rivers return. The horses would neigh and stamp the ground, their powerful bodies trembling as if they truly understood the gravity of the moment. When the very last horse was blessed, the Mai lifted his staff, a tall, imposing rod capped with carved ivory, and declared in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "Go forth as my shadow goes before me. Bring no shame upon your fathers." The fire was left to burn until dawn, and as the sun rose, its first rays were believed to carry the Mai's will across the entire empire, touching every corner of his domain. Behind the palace stood a vast, impressive structure of red clay and woven grass, the stables of the sun. This was where the Mai's personal horses were kept. Massive, powerful stallions from Fezzan and Nubia, their coats brushed until they gleamed like burnished copper under the African sun. Each horse had a name drawn from the Empire's greatest victories' names, like Engazagamu's Wind, Thunder of the Bornu Plains, Spearbreaker, or Child of the Moon. Their handlers were not mere grooms, they were spiritual caretakers, known as Malam al-Faras, or keepers of the horse's soul. They sang to the animals at dawn and dusk, believing that these songs calmed the spirit and forged an unbreakable trust between rider and beast. The Mai's favorite horse was always white, a living symbol of purity and divine favor. This horse was never ridden, except during a coronation or a war of destiny, a conflict that would decide the fate of the empire. Before a battle, this magnificent white stallion would be bathed with scented water and anointed with oil. Its mane was braided with shimmering gold threads and small, protective charms carved from ivory or bone. To see the Mai stride this horse was to witness divine will embodied, a sight designed to stir boundless courage in his own men and crush any doubt in the hearts of his enemies. The Mai rarely, if ever, shouted. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his words carried a rhythm like a prayer, deliberate, calm, and deeply resonant. During war councils, he would sit upon a low stool while his commanders presented maps drawn on animal hides and delivered scouts' reports. His advisors stood behind him, completely silent. The Mai would listen intently, then close his eyes. To those in the room, It seemed as if he were listening to something deeper, something beyond their senses, perhaps the whisper of spirits, or the murmurs of his ancestors. When he finally spoke, his decisions came not as mere orders, but as prophecy. At dawn, the wind will favor the west. Ride toward it, or the enemy will break at the third drumbeat. And when these prophecies inevitably proved true, his men's faith in him deepened into something unshakable. To disobey the Mai was not just insubordination, it was seen as a rebellion against the universe itself. Once every few years, the Mai performed a ritual that renewed his divine right to lead the cavalry, the ceremony of the 7 spears. Before the entire assembled army, 7 spears were laid in a crescent on the ground, each one representing one of the Empire's sacred regions. The Mai would walk among them barefoot, anointing each spearhead with oil. Then he lifted the first spear and thrust it into the air, declaring, "This is for Kanem-Bornu, our father's first road." The second followed. "This is for Bornu, our children shall ride." With each spear he lifted, the soldiers roared in unison, their thousands of voices becoming one as they raised their swords to the sky. At the final spear, the Mai knelt, pressed his forehead to the earth, and whispered, "As long as men and horses breathe, let our name not vanish from the sand." This was not a prayer to the gods. It was a solemn promise to history. To the people of Kanem-Bornu, the cavalry was never just a fighting force. It was a living symbol of divine order made visible on earth. Each horse represented strength, tempered by grace. Each disciplined formation symbolized the perfect harmony between a leader's will and a soldier's obedience. When the army rode out, banners held high, armor shining in the sun, hooves pounding the earth in a rhythmic unison, it was as though the cosmos itself was moving in perfect balance. The Mai's vision was not conquest for its own sake. It was preservation. It was the core belief that a world in balance must be defended by disciplined force. His cavalry were both warriors and guardians of cosmic law. Their unwavering loyalty kept chaos at bay, just as their sharp spears kept raiders from the Empire's gates. It is said that sometimes the Mai would leave his throne and walk alone into the desert at dusk. There, under a blanket of stars, he would press his hand to the cool sand and simply listen. He believed the desert spoke not in words, but in its vast, profound silence. When he returned to his palace, his eyes carried that same quiet fire, the look of a man who had touched something far beyond himself. In his reign, the Empire's strength was never just military. It was a deep spiritual resilience, a shared understanding that every battle, every drought, and every shifting dune was part of a grand, cosmic design. The Mai's vision bound men to purpose, horses to honor, and generations to a shared destiny. And when he rode at the head of his army, surrounded by dust and thunder, it was said that even the desert itself seemed to bow in reverence. When an empire fades, it rarely dies in silence. Its echoes living in the songs of its children, in the dust that still carries hoofprints, and in the myths that keep its heartbeat alive long after its banners have fallen. So it was with Kanem-Bornu, when its fortresses grew quiet and its trade routes thinned. When the great cavalry no longer thundered across the Sahel, the empire did not simply vanish. It dissolved gently, like a mirage returning to sand into the realm of legend. And in this realm, the horsemen became ghosts of glory. As the elders whispered in the moonlit dunes, they still ride. In the centuries that followed Kanem-Bornu's decline, strange visions haunted the old trade roads of the Sahara. Travelers crossing those ancient paths spoke of riders moving on the horizon at twilight, when the air shimmers between heat and cold. They were silent, tireless, unbound by wind or time. Some believed they were spirits, tasked with guarding the Empire's memory. Others thought they were the souls of fallen cavalrymen, forever patrolling the border between the living and the forgotten. In Canary oral poetry, these phantoms became known as *Fari, and Ruhu, the horses of the spirit. It was said their hooves struck sparks of memory from the sand. Each spark, a story. Each gust of wind, a prayer for the land that birthed them. Children grew up hearing the elders chant a powerful line. When the drums of Bornu were silenced, the horses learned to sing. The Empire's armies might have vanished, but its spirit rode on not in conquest, but in remembrance. The sacred duty of carrying these memories fell to the Griatsta, storytellers, drummers, and living historians of the Canary lineage. They were the memory keepers. Their songs and stories spoke not only of grand battles and political intrigue, but of loyalty, sacrifice, and the fierce, unspoken bond between a rider and his horse. An ancient verse, which survives even now among singers in Borno State, captures this beautifully. The sun rose over the Mai saddle and set in the breath of his horse. When both were gone, the desert slept, but the story never closed its eyes. Through these powerful songs, a new kind of victory was born. It wasn't one written in stone monuments or carved in the annals of war, but one that lived in the rhythm of words passed from one generation to the next. The Griots ensured that even as kingdoms crumbled and borders were redrawn, the essence of Kanem-Bornu, its courage, its dignity, its unyielding grace under hardship, would live forever in the mouths of its people. Let's pause here for a moment. Under the vast Sahelian sky, imagine the crackle of a small fire, the blanket of stars above, and the weight of history settling around us. Long after the last cavalry banner fell, the faith that once united the empire continued to anchor its descendants. Islam, which had been a rallying cry for Kanem-Bornu's unity and expansion, became the quiet, steady heartbeat of its survival. The grand mosques of Engazagamu and Kukawa, though now weathered by time, still echoed with the same prayers once recited before battle, but now they were whispered for peace. The old verses, carved into sun-baked walls centuries ago, were now recited by children learning to read the Quran. In those sacred words, history found its continuity. The spirit of discipline, devotion, and purpose that had once guided the riders through sandstorms and skirmishes now guided communities through the challenges of a new world. As a wise Kanuri proverb says, the man who forgets his ancestors forgets the road home. Faith, in this sense, became more than just religion. It became remembrance. Each call to prayer, carried on the desert wind, held a faint echo of the royal drum, the rhythm of hooves, and the enduring promise that no empire truly dies if its soul remains in motion. And this soul is not just a relic of the past. Today, in the far northeast of Nigeria, in Chad, and across the Sahel, the Canary people still tell the stories of their legendary horsemen. During vibrant festivals, men ride through dusty streets in bright robes and intricately embroidered turbans. Their horses, draped in woven cloths that shimmer in the golden sunlight, move with a familiar, ancestral grace. These are not mere historical reenactments. They feel like resurrections. The cheers of the crowd blend with the powerful beat of drumming that sounds, if you listen closely, like the Ngoma ya Bornu, the old war drum that once called nations to rise. Grandmothers, leaning on their canes, whisper to wide-eyed children, "That's how your ancestors rode. That's how they kept the desert awake." In those electrifying moments, history becomes tangible again as something distant and dusty, but as a living pulse inside a modern heart. Even the horses themselves seem to carry a kind of remembrance. descendants of the once mighty Bornu stallions, famous across Africa, still graze in dusty paddocks near the shores of Lake Chad. Their frames may be smaller now, leaner from generations of adaptation, but when they gallop, something ancient stirs. It's as if the desert recognizes them. The same winds that once carried the commands of armies now brush through their manes. Perhaps, in some mysterious way, the bloodlines of both horse and rider continue to echo the same timeless rhythm, one of loyalty, endurance, and profound pride. There is a phrase in the Kanuri language, whispered during storms, to bring luck. Fari Yaduo, the horse has returned. But it speaks of something deeper than superstition. It reveals a core belief that history circles back, that what was lost will, in some form, one day find its way home. The ruins of Engazagamu, the great walled city, still stand in fragments, whispering to the wind. The sands have covered the old wells, the palaces are gone, and the stables lie silent. Yet, if you walk there at dawn, when the world is still and hushed, you might hear a faint, rhythmic sound. It's not quite footsteps, but something between memory and imagination. The desert is a vast archive, and it remembers everything. Each gust of wind carries whispers of command. Each long shadow stretching across the dunes holds the silhouette of a rider and his horse. And when the night deepens and the stars return, the same stars that guided Kanem's horsemen centuries ago, feels, for a fleeting moment, as though time has folded back upon itself. The riders are still out there. Their silhouettes flicker in the mirage, eternal guardians of an empire that refused to fade away completely. Every Kanuri elder will tell you, with a deep sense of identity, we are the children of the riders. This isn't a boast. It's a statement of faith. To be Kanuri is to inherit the dust, the discipline, and the quiet dignity of those who rode before you. In the quiet of the evening, as the muezzin's call to prayer drifts across the plains, you can almost imagine them, again the horsemen assembling, the banners rising, the horizon trembling under the echo of hooves. And in that moment, the empire lives once more, not in walls or crowns, but in memory itself. The night thickens, the fire burns low, and the distant rhythm seems to fade, then return with the very breath of the desert. Because history never truly ends. It only changes its shape, and for Kanem-Bornu, that shape will always be a rider on horseback, moving steadily toward a horizon where the sun never quite sets,